Manhattan, 1878. A nurse stands in federal court, waiting to hear her sentence. Her crime? Selling sponges and syringes to women. Not surgical equipment, contraceptive supplies. Sarah Chase faces 10 years in prison for helping women control when they had children. Her prosecutor is Anthony Comstock, a postal inspector who convinced Congress that birth control information was obscenity. Under his law, even mailing a pamphlet about women's health could destroy your life. This isn't ancient history. This happened in America less than 150 years ago. Tonight, you'll learn how one man's moral crusade criminalized women's healthcare and drove contraception into a deadly underground market. Welcome to Hearts and History. I'm your host, and tonight we're exploring a dark chapter when women's bodies became federal crimes. Get comfortable, maybe grab some tea. This story is going to take us deep into Victorian America's war on women's autonomy. If you enjoy learning history while you drift off to sleep, hit subscribe and drop a comment. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? I love hearing from listeners around the world. Alright, let's go back to 1878, when knowledge about your own body could land you in prison for a decade. The birth of the Comstock Act. Picture this courtroom, gas lamps casting shadows on wood panelling, the air thick with coal smoke and dread. Sarah Chase stands before the judge, her hand steady despite everything. She's been fighting this battle for months. The charges? Selling articles designed for prevention of conception. In plain English, she sold contraceptive sponges and douching syringes to married women who couldn't afford another pregnancy. Behind the prosecutor's table sits Anthony Comstock himself, watching, waiting. This man has made it his life's work to control what women can know about their own bodies. New York in 1878 is a powder keg of moral panic. Immigration is changing the city's face. Irish Catholics, Eastern Europeans, freed slaves moving north, all having children that old Protestant families find threatening. The solution? Control reproduction. Not their own, of course. The wealthy can always find discreet physicians. It's everyone else who must be stopped. Sarah Chase represents everything they fear, a woman making her own living, helping other women take control. In their minds, she's not just breaking the law, she's breaking the natural order itself. Anthony Comstock enters the courtroom like a man on a holy mission, which, in his mind, he absolutely is. Born in rural Connecticut, Civil War veteran, evangelical Christian, he sees Satan's work everywhere he looks in New York City. Pornography in shop windows, prostitutes on street corners, and worst of all, women who think they can choose when to have children. To Comstock, contraception isn't healthcare, it's moral poison. It encourages sin. It destroys the sanctity of marriage. It must be stopped, by any means necessary, even if it means destroying lives. The law Comstock pushed through Congress is breathtakingly broad. Any article or thing designed for prevention of conception that covers everything: condoms, pessaries, douching syringes, information pamphlets, even medical textbooks, if they mention contraception. The punishment is savage, up to 10 years in federal prison, $5,000 fine. That's about $130,000 in today's money for helping a woman prevent pregnancy. Sarah Chase knew this when she started her practice. She did it anyway, because women were dying and someone had to help them. The atmosphere in that courtroom is suffocating with righteousness. Victorian morality turned into federal law. The judge, the prosecutors, the male spectators, they all see Sarah Chase the same way. A corrupted woman leading other women astray. They can't comprehend that she might be trying to save lives, that women who can't feed the children they have might not want more, that pregnancy without choice is a form of imprisonment. No, in their world, God decides when women have children, and women who disagree are criminals. Comstock has already made his reputation destroying lives. Madame Restell, New York's most famous female physician, she committed suicide rather than face the prison sentence he engineered. Victoria Woodhull, the first woman to run for president, arrested for publishing articles about free love. Emma Goldman, repeatedly jailed for lecturing about contraception. The pattern is always the same. Comstock targets women who dare to challenge the system. He uses federal law as a weapon, and he genuinely believes he's doing God's work. That's what makes him so dangerous. Sarah Chase's clients were desperate women, factory workers already feeding 4 children on starvation wages, immigrants crowded into tenement rooms with no privacy, wives whose husbands drank away their earnings. These women came to her because they had nowhere else to turn. The wealthy could always find discreet physicians willing to provide family planning services. But poor women, they had Sarah Chase, or they had nothing, and nothing meant dangerous home remedies, black market pills, coat hangers, death. Sarah Chase stood between them and that darkness. The evidence against her is almost comical in its pettiness. Contraceptive sponges displayed like weapons, syringes treated as instruments of moral destruction, pamphlets with basic anatomy diagrams labelled as obscene literature. But there's nothing funny about the sentence she's facing. 10 years in federal prison for helping women control their fertility. Her crime isn't fraud or theft or violence. It's knowledge. The knowledge that women don't have to accept unlimited pregnancies, that they can choose. In 1878 America, that knowledge is considered more dangerous than dynamite. The socio-economic forces at work here run deeper than individual prejudice. Victorian America built its social order on women's sexual purity and reproductive submission. Women who could control their fertility threatened the entire system. They might delay marriage, choose careers, leave abusive husbands, have time for education, for politics, for independent thought. The Comstock Act isn't really about obscenity, it's about power, about keeping women in their assigned place. And Anthony Comstock is just the weapon they're using to enforce that order. Sarah Chase represents rebellion against everything they believe. As Sarah Chase waits for her sentence, she knows she's fighting for more than her own freedom. She's fighting for every woman who will come after her, every mother who needs to space her children, every wife who wants to survive her reproductive years, every woman who believes she should have some say in her own fate. The judge will speak soon. The sentence will fall. But this courtroom drama is just the beginning. The real battle, the one that will rage for decades, is just getting started. And Anthony Comstock has no idea what he's unleashed. Resurrecting America's contraceptive legacy. Picture this. It's 1820. Boston. A young woman walks into Dr. Charles Knowlton's office and asks about preventing pregnancy. He doesn't whisper. He doesn't look around nervously. He opens a medical textbook, points to diagrams of the female reproductive system, and explains her options. Pessaries made of silk and rubber, douching solutions, herbal tinctures from Europe, all perfectly legal, all discussed openly in medical journals. This wasn't some underground network. This was healthcare. Normal, accepted, unremarkable healthcare. Hard to believe, right? Considering what happened to Sarah Chase 50 years later. Before Anthony Comstock turned contraception into a federal crime, America had what you might call a golden age of reproductive freedom. Not that anyone called it that back then. They just called it normal life. Women controlled their fertility with methods passed down through generations. Doctors prescribed pessaries alongside laudanum for headaches. Druggists sold condoms next to cough syrup. Medical schools taught contraceptive techniques as standard curriculum. The 1832 edition of Robert Dale Owen's Moral Physiology sold like hotcakes, 25,000 copies, openly discussing withdrawal, douching, the rhythm method. Nobody got arrested for buying it. The methods themselves, some ingenious, some terrifying, pessaries, these were basically early cervical caps, made from everything you can imagine, silk soaked in lemon juice, rubber moulded into cup shapes, even half a lemon rind, believe it or not. The citric acid worked as a spermicide. Women in New Orleans swore by it. Condoms existed too, though they called them French letters or rubber goods, made from sheep intestines or vulcanized rubber. Expensive, so they got washed and reused. Not exactly pleasant, but effective enough. The wealthy had options the poor couldn't dream of. Douching was everywhere. Every pharmacy sold syringes and solutions. Alum water, vinegar, even Lysol, though that came later and was absolutely toxic. Women mixed up concoctions based on folk wisdom passed from mothers to daughters. Some worked through acidity, disrupting the natural environment sperm needed to survive. Others were pure wishful thinking. The medical establishment took it seriously, though. Dr. Edward Foot's Medical Common Sense devoted entire chapters to douching techniques, published openly, advertised in newspapers, discussed at ladies' tea parties. This wasn't hidden knowledge. This was Tuesday afternoon conversation. Herbal methods came from everywhere. Native American women had introduced European settlers to certain plants: tansy, pennyroyal, cohosh root. Enslaved women brought knowledge from Africa: cotton root bark, wild carrot seeds. German immigrants shared European remedies: Queen Anne's lace, rue. These weren't just folk tales. Actual physicians prescribed them. Dr. John Gunn's Domestic Medicine listed dozens of plants for promoting the menses. Everyone knew what that meant. Bringing on late periods, whether you were pregnant or just worried you might be. The line between contraception and early abortion was flexible, and nobody seemed particularly bothered by that. Medical literature treated all this as routine healthcare. The Boston Medical and Surgical Journal published articles on contraceptive techniques. Medical schools at Harvard, Pennsylvania, Columbia, all taught family planning methods. Dr. Family Planning, Charles Knowlton's Fruits of Philosophy, became the standard textbook, not hidden in back rooms. Assigned reading. Students took notes on withdrawal timing, douching solutions, pessary insertion techniques, the same way they studied broken bones or fever treatment. Medicine was medicine. Preventing pregnancy was just another medical procedure. Nothing shameful about it. Nothing criminal. Nothing that would land you in federal prison for a decade. Women shared knowledge openly. Letters between sisters included detailed instructions on douching solutions. Friends recommended pessary makers the way they recommended seamstresses. Martha Washington's correspondence mentions preventing too frequent addition to the family. Abigail Adams wrote to her daughter about managing birth spacing. These weren't whispered conversations in dark corners. They were normal parts of women's lives. Sisterhood meant sharing practical knowledge about controlling your fertility. The idea that this information could be considered obscene, that sharing it could be a federal crime, would have seemed absolutely insane to these women. But here's what's chilling. You can see the change coming. By the 1850s, some voices were getting uncomfortable, not with contraception itself, but with who was using it. Middle-class Protestant women were having fewer children, while immigrant families kept growing. Birth rates among the right kind of Americans were dropping. Editorial writers started using phrases like race suicide. Medical journals began questioning whether family limitation was morally appropriate. Religious leaders, who'd mostly ignored the issue, started paying attention. The storm clouds were gathering. The golden age was ending. Nobody could have predicted how completely the sky would fall. The 1860s brought the first real restrictions. Not federal yet, just nervous murmuring in state legislatures. Connecticut passed a law in 1879 making it illegal to use contraceptives. New York started regulating what could be sold in drugstores. Massachusetts restricted advertisements for articles for ladies. Still, most of America operated under the old system. Doctors prescribed, pharmacists sold, women used whatever worked. The underground wasn't underground yet, it was just becoming less above ground. The freedom was slipping away so gradually that most people didn't notice until it was gone, until Sarah Chase stood in that courtroom, sentenced to prison for selling sponges. Think about what was lost. 50 years of medical progress, erased overnight. Generations of women's knowledge, suddenly criminal. Dr. Knowlton's textbooks, banned from the mail. Pharmacy shelves, stripped of douching syringes. Medical schools, forbidden from teaching what they'd taught for decades. The same pessaries that had been prescribed routinely became evidence in federal prosecutions. Condoms went from drugstore staples to smuggled contraband. Herbal remedies that grandmothers had used for centuries became grounds for arrest. Knowledge that had been as common as recipes for bread became dangerous secrets. The transformation was stunning, and it happened fast. The older generation must have been bewildered. Women who'd openly discussed family planning with their doctors suddenly couldn't mention it without risking prosecution. Physicians who'd prescribed contraceptives for decades found themselves afraid to put anything in writing. Pharmacists removed products they'd sold for years. The same methods, the same devices, the same information, but now criminal. The contrast couldn't have been starker. From medical textbooks to federal crime in less than a generation. From open conversation to whispered secrets. From women's healthcare to moral obscenity. Anthony Comstock didn't just change the law, he changed the entire relationship between women and their bodies. This is what Sarah Chase was fighting against. Not just prison time or fines, but the complete erasure of women's reproductive freedom. She remembered the before times, when selling contraceptive sponges was just business, when teaching about douching was healthcare, when women controlled their own fertility without government interference. That's what made her case so tragic and so important. She wasn't just defending her right to earn a living, she was defending an entire lost world. A world where women's bodies belonged to women, where knowledge wasn't criminal, where family planning was medicine, not morality. That world existed. For 50 years it thrived. Then it disappeared, almost overnight. The rise of the social purity movement. Picture America in 1870. Women could buy contraceptives at drugstores. Doctors openly discussed family planning. Medical journals published articles about preventing pregnancy. This was normal, legal, unremarkable, but something dark was stirring in the shadows of Victorian society. A movement of moral reformers, evangelical Christians, and self-appointed guardians of virtue, who believed that women's access to birth control was destroying the very fabric of civilization. They called themselves the Social Purity Movement, and they were about to change everything. The movement started quietly. Church groups, women's moral societies, wealthy Protestant reformers, horrified by the prostitution and vice they saw in rapidly growing cities. But their focus soon shifted to something more insidious, the idea that contraception itself was immoral. Think about this logic. If women could prevent pregnancy, they reasoned, moral restraint would collapse, marriage would lose its sacred purpose, young people would indulge in premarital sex. The entire social order, built on women's sexual purity and their confinement to motherhood, would crumble into chaos. They weren't just targeting prostitution anymore, they were targeting married women, respectable women, women who simply wanted to space their children or limit their families for health reasons. The reformers painted these women as selfish, immoral, destroying God's plan for womanhood. Contraception advertisements in newspapers, evil temptation, pessaries sold in drugstores, tools of corruption, medical textbooks discussing family planning, obscene literature. The movement was redefining normal healthcare as moral perversion, and they were gaining followers fast. The rhetoric was becoming vicious. Purity reformers claimed that birth control encouraged prostitution, spread venereal disease, and turned virtuous wives into wanton women. They argued that voluntary motherhood, that's what they called a woman's right to choose when to have children, was against nature, against God, against the fundamental order of society. Women who practiced contraception weren't just making personal choices. They were criminals threatening civilization itself. This wasn't fringe thinking anymore. This was becoming mainstream Protestant doctrine. Enter Anthony Comstock, born 1844, rural Connecticut, Civil War veteran, failed salesman in New York City. But here's what made him dangerous. He wasn't just a moral crusader. He was a man with deep personal rage, wrapped in religious righteousness. Comstock saw the city as a cesspool of vice. Immigrants, prostitutes, pornography, birth control, all connected in his mind as threats to Christian America. And unlike most reformers who just preached, Comstock was willing to take action, violent action if necessary. He carried a gun and wasn't afraid to use it. Comstock started working with police in the late 1860s, providing tips for raids on merchants selling what he considered obscene materials. But his real genius was understanding that moral outrage could be profitable. He cultivated relationships with wealthy Christian businessmen who shared his vision of moral purity. These weren't just religious zealots. These were powerful men who saw social control as essential to protecting their economic interests. Immigration, labor unrest, changing gender roles, all threats to the established order that needed to be contained. The money started flowing. J.P. Morgan, the financier, Samuel Colgate, the soap magnate, Morris Jessup, the railroad baron, members of the Young Men's Christian Association who funded Comstock's work and paid him a full-time salary to pursue obscenity cases. This wasn't grassroots activism. This was a coordinated campaign by America's wealthiest Protestant elite to impose their moral vision on the entire country. They had the resources, the connections, and the political influence to make it happen, and Comstock was their weapon. By 1872, the social purity movement controlled the conversation about public morality. Newspapers praised Comstock's raids, politicians courted purity voters, religious leaders preached sermons connecting birth control to social decay. The movement had successfully reframed women's health care as a moral crisis. Contraception wasn't medicine anymore, it was obscenity. Women seeking family planning weren't patients. They were victims of predatory doctors and immoral merchants. The cultural shift was complete. Now they needed legal power to enforce their vision. Comstock began drafting federal legislation, not just against pornography, that was already illegal in most places. His law would specifically criminalize birth control, information about contraception, devices designed to prevent pregnancy. Anything that gave women control over their fertility would become a federal crime. He called it an act for the suppression of trade in obscene literature and articles of immoral use. That phrase, immoral use, was deliberately vague. It could mean anything. It could target anyone. That was the point. The atmosphere was becoming suffocating. Doctors stopped discussing family planning with patients, afraid of prosecution. Pharmacists removed contraceptive devices from their shelves. Publishers refused to print medical textbooks that mentioned birth control. Women began whispering about folk remedies and dangerous home abortions. The mere threat of legal action was already driving reproductive health care underground, and Comstock hadn't even gotten his law passed yet. The chilling effect was working exactly as intended. In early 1873, Comstock travelled to Washington with his Chamber of Horrors, a collection of erotic images, sexual devices, and contraceptives that he displayed to shocked politicians in the vice president's office. Congress was horrified. Here was visual proof of America's moral decay, presented by a righteous Christian soldier offering a solution. The timing was perfect. The final days of the legislative session, when controversial bills could be rushed through without proper debate, everything was falling into place. March 3rd, 1873, the point of no return. In just a few hours, Congress would pass Comstock's bill in the dying minutes of the session. 50 years of legal contraception in America was about to end. Women's sexual autonomy was about to become a federal crime. The social purity movement was about to achieve total victory, and Anthony Comstock, he was about to become the most powerful moral enforcer in American history, armed with federal authority and a badge that would terrorize women for decades to come. The trap was closing, lobbying for a moral purge. Picture this: January 1872, Anthony Comstock boards a train to Washington, carrying a leather satchel packed with what he calls evidence of America's moral decay. Inside that bag, contraceptive devices, erotic books, and things that would make congressmen's wives faint. He's heading to the Capitol with one mission: convince the entire federal government that birth control is obscenity. And here's the terrifying part: it's going to work. Because when Comstock walked into that building, women still had rights. When he walked out, those rights were about to become federal crimes. Comstock wasn't some random postal worker with strong opinions. By 1872, he'd already built a reputation in New York as a vice hunter. He'd spent 3 years working with police, raiding bookstores, and arresting people who sold what he considered immoral materials. But local raids weren't enough anymore. He wanted federal power, real power, the kind that could reach into every American home through the mail system. So he drafted his own legislation, word by word, comma by comma. The man literally wrote the law that would criminalize women's health care for the next 50 years. His backers weren't small-time moralists either. J.P. Morgan, yes, that J.P. Morgan, was funding this crusade. Samuel Colgate, the soap magnate, wealthy Christian businessmen who genuinely believed that birth control would destroy American civilization. They'd given Comstock a salary, an office, and unlimited resources to pursue what they called purity work. These weren't fringe religious nuts. These were the most powerful men in America, and they were terrified that women might gain control over their own bodies. So they weaponized Anthony Comstock to stop it from happening. The journey to Washington took 2 days by train. Comstock spent that time organizing his Chamber of Horrors. That's what he actually called it. Dildos, condoms, pessaries, syringes used for douching, rubber goods sold for marital aid, books explaining female anatomy, pamphlets describing contraceptive methods, letters between women discussing how to prevent pregnancy. All of it carefully arranged to create maximum shock value. He knew exactly what he was doing: show congressmen materials they'd never seen in polite society, and they'd criminalize everything just to make the embarrassment stop. February 12th, 1872. Comstock arrives at the Capitol building carrying his satchel of horrors. He'd arranged meetings with key congressmen, not public hearings, mind you. Private demonstrations. Room by room, politician by politician, he'd open that bag and spread its contents across mahogany tables. Watch grown men turn red. Listen to them stammer excuses about wives and daughters. See them promise to vote for anything that would make this uncomfortable conversation end. It was psychological warfare disguised as moral reform, and it was working perfectly. The climax came in the vice president's room. Schuyler Colfax had agreed to host what Comstock called a demonstration for congressional leadership. Picture this scene: crystal chandelier, expensive carpet, oil paintings of founding fathers watching from gilded frames. And there's Anthony Comstock laying out sex toys and birth control devices like he's arranging evidence at a murder trial. Senators backing away from the table, representatives covering their eyes, the vice president himself looking like he wanted to disappear through the floor. This was Comstock's master stroke. He didn't just show them the materials, he told stories. This rubber cap, he'd say, pointing to a cervical barrier, was sold to unmarried girls to encourage promiscuity. These pills, waving a bottle of herbal abortifacients, killed babies and corrupted innocent women. This pamphlet, holding up medical information about preventing pregnancy, turned wives against their sacred duty to bear children. Every item became evidence of national moral collapse. Every contraceptive device became proof that women's rights would destroy Christian civilization. The congressmen ate it up. They were horrified and convinced. Within weeks, Comstock's legislation was moving through Congress faster than anyone expected. The Act for the Suppression of Trade in and Circulation of Obscene Literature and Articles of Immoral Use, that was the official name. It made mailing any information about preventing conception a federal crime punishable by up to 10 years in prison and $5,000 in fines. Not just the devices themselves, information about the devices, medical textbooks, letters between women, advertisements, anything that acknowledged contraception existed. It was the most comprehensive attack on women's healthcare in American history. March 3rd, 1873, the final hours of the congressional session. Most representatives had already gone home for the weekend, but Comstock's supporters stayed behind, pushing the bill through in a voice vote, with almost no debate, no hearings, no public discussion, no input from women's groups or medical professionals. Just a handful of politicians, exhausted and eager to finish their work, criminalizing birth control because one man with a satchful of sex toys had convinced them it was necessary. The Comstock Act became federal law at 11:47 p.m., slipped through in the darkness. But passing the law was only half of Comstock's plan. The next morning, March 4th, he walked into the Postmaster General's office with a new request: make him the special agent responsible for enforcing his own legislation. Think about that for a second. The man who wrote the law wanted the power to enforce it personally, and they gave it to him. Anthony Comstock became a federal agent with a badge, a gun, and unlimited authority to decide what Americans could send through the mail. He could arrest anyone, search any package, define obscenity however he wanted. His first act as special agent: print business cards reading Anthony Comstock, United States Agent, Suppression of Vice and Immorality. He ordered a revolver and a set of handcuffs. He hired informants to watch bookstores and pharmacies. He began opening mail suspected of containing contraceptive information. Within 6 months, he'd made over 100 arrests. Doctors, publishers, pharmacists, women who'd written letters about preventing pregnancy. He was building a reign of terror, one prosecution at a time, and the federal government was paying his salary to do it. By Christmas 1873, Anthony Comstock had achieved something unprecedented in American history. He'd single-handedly criminalized women's healthcare at the federal level and positioned himself as the man with power to enforce those crimes. Every contraceptive device, every medical pamphlet, every private letter discussing family planning, all of it now illegal to mail. For women across America, the morning after the Comstock Act felt like waking up in a different country, one where their bodies belonged to the government and their right to information had become a federal crime. Comstock had won completely. The Comstock Crusades begin. 1873. Anthony Comstock had his federal badge now, Special Agent of the United States Post Office, and he was done playing around. The man who'd convinced Congress to criminalize birth control information was about to unleash hell on anyone who dared help women control their fertility. His first targets: the boldest women in America, the ones who believed knowledge shouldn't be a crime, the advocates of what they called voluntary motherhood, women who thought maybe, just maybe, they should have a say in their own bodies. Victoria Woodhull should have seen it coming. First woman to run for president, first woman to address Congress, publisher of a radical newspaper that dared discuss women's sexuality openly. She was everything Comstock despised, a woman who refused to stay quiet. November 1872, just months before his law passed. Comstock had her arrested for publishing articles about free love and marriage reform. The charge? Sending obscene materials through the mail. Victoria spent weeks in jail. Her crime? Writing about women's right to sexual autonomy. But Victoria Woodhull was famous. She had money, lawyers, connections. The women Comstock really wanted to destroy were different. They were the quiet heroes working in tenement neighborhoods, the ones who actually helped desperate women day after day. Women like Dr. Sarah Chase, and she never saw him coming. Chase travelled city to city, giving lectures on women's health. Afterward, she'd sell contraceptive supplies, sponges, syringes, pessaries, the tools women needed to survive. To Comstock, she was a monster preying on innocence. Picture Sarah Chase in that Manhattan courtroom, 1878. 5 years of Comstock's law crushing anyone who dared help women. She's standing there, this nurse who dedicated her life to women's health education, listening to Anthony Comstock testify against her. He's calling her a criminal, a corrupter of morals. Her crime, selling sponges and syringes to women who desperately wanted to control when they had children. The judge sentences her to prison for trying to keep women alive and healthy. The message was clear: help women, go to jail. Comstock wasn't just going after individual women, he was systematically destroying an entire network of healthcare. Pharmacists who'd openly sold contraceptives for decades suddenly found federal agents at their doors. Publishers who'd printed medical textbooks with chapters on preventing pregnancy watched their books banned from the mail. Physicians who'd quietly helped married women space their pregnancies now risked prosecution. The Underground Railroad of women's healthcare was being dismantled brick by brick, and Comstock was loving every minute of it. The worst part, Comstock genuinely believed he was saving America. In his twisted mind, these women weren't healers. They were predators. Every arrest, every conviction, every suicide his prosecutions caused, he saw it as God's work. He kept meticulous records, boasted to reporters about driving 15 people to kill themselves. "I am sure the world is better off without them," he wrote. This wasn't law enforcement. This was moral warfare, and the casualties were piling up in tenement apartments across the country. By 1875, the fear was everywhere. Women who'd spent their careers helping other women were shutting down their practices. Medical schools stopped teaching about contraception entirely. Textbooks that mentioned family planning disappeared from library shelves. The knowledge that had been passed down for generations, mother to daughter, woman to woman, was being criminalized. Comstock had turned women's bodies into federal property, and the women who understood this best were the ones dying from botched abortions and dangerous patent medicines. Then came his biggest target yet. Anne Lohman, though the world knew her as Madame Restell. For 30 years, she'd been New York's most successful female physician. Rich women, poor women, desperate teenagers, they all came to her. She provided safe abortions when they were legal, and contraceptives always. She'd built an empire helping women control their fertility. She was wealthy, respected, untouchable. Until Comstock decided she wasn't. 1878, the same year he destroyed Sarah Chase. Restell's turn was coming. Comstock played the long game with Restell. Sent an undercover agent pretending to need help for his wife. Restell, who'd been doing this for decades, saw right through it, but she helped anyway. Because that's what she did. She helped women. The arrest was front-page news. New York's most famous female doctor dragged away in handcuffs. The trial would be a spectacle, the humiliation unbearable. Facing years in federal prison at age 67, Restell made a choice that broke Comstock's victims had been making. She killed herself instead. April 1st, 1878. Anne Lohman was found dead in her bathtub, throat cut with a carving knife. The newspapers called it justice. Comstock wrote in his diary that he was glad she was dead. Think about that. A federal agent celebrating the suicide of a woman whose only crime was helping other women. But here's what really happened. With Restell gone, thousands of women lost their safest option. The back alley butchers moved in. The infection rate soared. The death toll climbed. Comstock had won another battle in his war against women. The pattern was set. Comstock would identify women providing reproductive health care, build cases against them using undercover agents and entrapment, then prosecute them with the full weight of federal law. The victims weren't just the women he arrested, they were the thousands who lost access to safe care. Every pharmacy that stopped selling pessaries, every doctor who stopped discussing family planning, every woman forced to resort to dangerous patent medicines because knowledge had become a crime. The crusade was working exactly as intended. By 1880, Comstock's reign of terror was complete. The women who'd built America's first reproductive healthcare network were dead, imprisoned, or driven underground. The knowledge that could save women's lives was locked away in medical libraries or destroyed entirely. Contraception had gone from openly available to federally criminalized in less than a decade. And the man responsible, he was just getting started. This was only the beginning of a 50-year nightmare that would kill thousands of women, all in the name of protecting them from themselves. Blooms in the Comstock wasteland. Underground networks don't just appear overnight. They grow slowly, carefully, like weeds through concrete cracks. By 1880, 7 years after Comstock's law, something fascinating was happening. The more he tried to crush birth control, the more creative people became at hiding it. Pharmacies started advertising feminine hygiene products and marital aids. Mail-order companies sold womb supporters that looked suspiciously like cervical caps. Patent medicine companies hawked bottles of female regulators that promised to bring down delayed menses. Everyone knew what these things really were. The question was, could Comstock prove it in court? The coded language became an art form. Picture opening a newspaper in 1885 and seeing ads for Portuguese female pills guaranteed to restore female regularity, or Dr. Jackson's English tablets for obstructed monthly courses. These weren't subtle hints. These were birth control advertisements hiding behind Victorian euphemisms. Smart women knew exactly what bringing down the menses meant. They understood that restoring regularity often meant ending an unwanted pregnancy. The advertisers walked a razor-thin line between helping desperate women and landing themselves in federal prison. Some didn't make it across. Mail-order catalogues became lifelines for women in rural areas. The Sears catalogue sat next to others selling hygienic rubber goods and preventive shields. One company, run by a woman named Mrs. Phillips, advertised ladies' private companion kits containing douching syringes, sponges, and mysterious powders. She shipped them in plain brown packages marked medical supplies. For $3, about $90 today, desperate women could receive what doctors couldn't legally prescribe. Phillips made a fortune before Comstock's agents finally caught up with her in 1887. Pharmacists became masters of doublespeak. Walk into a drugstore in Chicago, ask for something to help with my female troubles, and the pharmacist might slide a small package across the counter. Inside, pessaries made of cocoa butter and boric acid, or rubber shields that fit over the cervix. The transaction happened without anyone speaking the forbidden words. If investigators asked, the pharmacist sold hygiene products, the customer bought health supplies. Both understood the real purpose. This silent conspiracy kept thousands of women from unwanted pregnancies and kept pharmacists out of jail. But here's where it gets dark. Patent medicine companies realized desperate women would try anything. So they started selling actual poison, marketed as female regulators, bottles of pennyroyal extract that could cause liver failure, pills containing lead acetate that promised to restore monthly flow but delivered organ damage instead, cotton root bark preparations that sometimes worked and sometimes killed. Women bought these knowing the risks because they had no safer options. The underground market that bloomed to circumvent Comstock's law became a minefield of deadly choices. The most dangerous products came with the prettiest names: Dr. Monroe's French periodical pills, Madame Drunette's lunar pills for ladies, Chichester's English pennyroyal pills, Each bottle promised gentle relief from suppressed menstruation. What they delivered was a lottery ticket. Some women took them and simply got sick. Others hemorrhaged. The lucky ones, if you can call them lucky, just wasted their money on sugar pills. But every month, women died from these concoctions. Comstock's law had turned birth control from a medical issue into a game of Russian roulette. Women created their own networks. Whispered advice passed from neighbour to neighbour. Sarah tells Mary about the druggist on 5th Street who understands women's problems. Mary tells her sister about the mail order company that ships hygienic supplies in unmarked boxes. These whisper networks operated like underground railroads, connecting women to resources while keeping everyone protected through plausible deniability. If questioned by authorities, they were just discussing female health. The sisterhood of survival that Comstock's law accidentally created became more powerful than any organized resistance movement. Some mail order operations got incredibly sophisticated. One company in Philadelphia used a network of female agents who traveled door to door in working class neighborhoods. They carried suitcases filled with ladies' necessities, douching equipment, sponges soaked in various solutions, and instructional pamphlets disguised as hygiene guides. If authorities showed up, these were traveling saleswomen selling household products. But desperate wives knew better. For 50 cents, about $15 today, they could buy supplies that might prevent another mouth to feed. The agents made good money and genuinely helped women survive. The irony was perfect. Comstock's law, designed to protect women from immoral influences, drove them into genuinely dangerous territory. Before 1873, women could buy relatively safe contraceptives from reputable sources. After Comstock, they had to navigate a black market filled with quacks, poisonous remedies, and devices made from God knows what materials. A pessary made by a legitimate manufacturer might cost more but wouldn't cause infection. A black market version might be made from toxic rubber or improperly shaped metal that could cause serious injury. But here's what gets me. Women kept fighting. They risked imprisonment, poisoning, social ostracism, and death because controlling their fertility was worth any risk. Working women who couldn't afford another pregnancy found ways to buy preventives. Farm wives in remote areas sent carefully worded letters to mail-order companies. Immigrant women shared folk remedies that sometimes worked and sometimes killed. Each purchase, each whispered recommendation, each coded advertisement was an act of rebellion against a law that treated their bodies as property of the state. By the 1890s, the underground contraceptive economy was massive. Millions of dollars changed hands annually. Thousands of women worked as agents, advertisers, manufacturers, and distributors. Entire industries existed in the shadows, serving women that the law pretended didn't exist. Comstock had accidentally created exactly what he feared most, a thriving network of women helping women circumvent male authority. His moral crusade had backfired spectacularly, turning birth control from a private medical matter into a nationwide act of civil disobedience. These underground blooms in Comstock's wasteland proved something he never understood. Women's desire to control their fertility wasn't a moral failing that could be legislated away. It was a fundamental human need that would find expression regardless of legal barriers. The more he tried to suppress it, the more resourceful, desperate, and ultimately powerful these networks became. Every coded advertisement, every whispered recommendation, every package shipped in plain brown wrapper was a seed of the reproductive rights movement that would eventually overturn his legacy. The uprising's brave defiance against the Comstock Act. Finally, some heroes. After decades of Comstock terrorizing anyone who dared speak about women's health, something beautiful started happening. People began fighting back. Not quietly, not carefully, boldly, openly, defiantly. These weren't politicians or wealthy philanthropists making change from comfortable boardrooms. These were doctors, activists, and everyday women who looked at this ridiculous law and said absolutely not. They knew they'd face prison. They knew they'd be destroyed in the press. They did it anyway. Their courage changed everything. Dr. Henry Arthur Albert broke first. England, 1886. This physician had watched too many women die from back-alley procedures and dangerous folk remedies. So he wrote the Wife's Handbook, a simple, cheap manual explaining women's health and contraception. The medical establishment was furious. How dare he make this information available to common women at a price they could afford? They stripped him of his medical license, destroyed his career. Albert didn't care. He'd rather lose his profession than watch one more woman die from ignorance. Word of Albert's defiance crossed the Atlantic and lit fires here. American women realized they weren't powerless. They could fight. Emma Goldman stepped up first, this fierce anarchist who'd already spent years challenging every authority she could find. Goldman started giving public lectures about contraception, not hidden talks in back rooms. Public speeches. She'd stand on stages in packed halls and explain exactly how women could control their fertility. The authorities arrested her repeatedly. She kept talking. Each arrest made her more famous, more dangerous to Comstock's regime. Goldman understood something Comstock didn't. Every time they arrested her, they proved her point. Look at this. She'd tell audiences, they're so terrified of women having knowledge about their own bodies that they'll throw me in jail for talking about it. What does that tell you about who really holds the power here? Her speeches drew thousands. Working women, immigrant mothers, young wives. They packed theatres to hear someone finally say what they'd been thinking, that this law was insane, that women deserved better. Mary Ware Dennett took a different approach. Where Goldman was fiery and radical, Dennett was methodical and precise. This Massachusetts mother of three decided to write the sex education pamphlet she wished had existed when she was young. The sex side of life. Frank, medical, honest. No euphemisms, no shame, just clear information about human sexuality and reproduction. She knew it would get her prosecuted under the Comstock Act. She published it anyway, because her own children deserved accurate information, and so did everyone else's. Dennett's pamphlet spread like wildfire. Parents copied it by hand and passed it to neighbours. Teachers smuggled it into schools. Young people finally had something that explained their bodies without treating sexuality like a disease. Of course, Comstock's agents came for her. 1929, they prosecuted Dennett for obscenity. Her crime? Writing educational material that treated human reproduction as normal and natural. The trial became a sensation. Here was this dignified mother facing prison for trying to educate America's children. The absurdity was becoming impossible to ignore. The courtroom drama was perfect. Dennett's lawyers argued that education couldn't be obscenity. That information designed to help people make informed decisions about their lives wasn't corrupting, it was essential. The prosecution looked ridiculous trying to claim that basic anatomy was somehow dangerous. When the appeals court ruled in Dennett's favour in 1930, it created the first real crack in the Comstock Act. Educational materials, they ruled, weren't automatically obscene. Knowledge wasn't criminal. It was a small victory, but victories had been so rare that it felt monumental. Margaret Sanger was watching all of this. Learning, planning. She'd been thinking about challenging Comstock for years, but these early victories showed her how. You didn't defeat bad law by following it quietly. You defeated it by breaking it so publicly, so obviously, so righteously, that the system had no choice but to change. Sanger started the Woman Rebel newsletter in 1914. The slogan, "No Gods, No Masters." Every issue was a direct challenge to the Comstock Act, deliberately designed to force a prosecution that would test the law. When the indictment came, Sanger made a brilliant move. She fled to Europe before trial, not to hide, but to study. She spent months learning about birth control methods that were legal and widely used in other countries. European women had access to safe, effective contraception. European doctors openly discussed family planning. The contrast was stark. America was the backward country here, not the moral leader Comstock claimed. Sanger returned in 1916 with a plan that would force the entire system to confront its hypocrisy. October 1916, Brooklyn's Brownsville neighborhood. Sanger opened America's first birth control clinic right there in broad daylight. A storefront with a sign in English, Yiddish, and Italian announcing birth control information for women. Lines of mothers formed around the block. Finally, somewhere they could get real help. The clinic operated for 10 days before police raided it. 10 days of providing services that were desperately needed and completely illegal. Sanger was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 30 days in jail. She called it the best 30 days of her life. The trial created exactly what Sanger wanted, a legal precedent that started dismantling the Comstock Act. The judge ruled that doctors could prescribe contraceptives when medically necessary. It was a tiny exception, but it was enough. Once you admit that contraception has legitimate medical uses, you can't call it inherently obscene. The wall was cracking, each brave act of defiance, Allbutt's handbook, Goldman's speeches, Dennett's pamphlet, Sanger's clinic, added pressure until something had to give. The moral crusade was finally meeting organized resistance. These weren't perfect people fighting perfect battles. Goldman was a radical anarchist. Sanger had problematic views on eugenics. Dennett came from privilege that protected her in ways others didn't have. But they shared something crucial, the absolute conviction that women deserved accurate information about their own bodies. They were willing to sacrifice their freedom, their careers, their reputations for that principle. Their courage lit a fire that would burn down Comstock's entire system of sexual suppression. The uprising had begun. Change was coming. Finally, the first strike against the Comstock, the woman rebel. By 1914, Anthony Comstock had terrorized women for 40 years. His postal inspectors prowled the mail. His laws criminalized basic health information. Women died from back-alley procedures and poisonous remedies because knowledge was forbidden. Then a 34-year-old nurse named Margaret Sanger decided she'd had enough. She was about to become Comstock's worst nightmare, a woman who refused to stay quiet, who wouldn't back down, and who had nothing left to lose. Sanger wasn't born a rebel. She was one of 11 children in a working-class Irish Catholic family. Her mother died at 50 after 18 pregnancies. 18. That number haunted Margaret her entire life. She became a nurse, married, had 3 children. Normal life. Then she started working on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Immigrant women, desperate and dying, begging her for the secret wealthy women knew. How do you stop having babies? And Margaret realized she couldn't tell them. It was illegal. Comstock's law made helping them a federal crime. March 1914. Margaret Sanger launches The Woman Rebel from her kitchen table. A radical newsletter with a dangerous mission to defy the Comstock Act by openly discussing birth control. The masthead declared no gods, no masters. Inside, articles about women's right to control their own bodies. Contraceptive information that could send her to prison for 10 years. She wrote, "A woman's body belongs to herself alone." In 1914, that statement was revolutionary and completely illegal under federal law. The woman rebel spread like wildfire through New York's immigrant neighborhoods. Women passed copies hand to hand, whispering about this nurse who dared to write what they all needed to know. Sanger published 7 issues before the government struck back, each edition more defiant than the last. She called women slaves of their reproductive organs. She declared birth control a fundamental human right. Postal inspectors were watching. Comstock's agents were building a case. But Margaret kept writing, kept printing, kept mailing. She knew exactly what she was risking. August 1914. Federal marshals arrive at Margaret's door with an indictment. 9 counts of violating the Comstock Act. Each count carried a potential 45 years in prison, 400 years total, if convicted on all charges. Sanger stared at the legal papers and realised this was it, the fight she'd been preparing for. Comstock himself wanted her destroyed, but instead of surrendering, she made a decision that shocked everyone. She would flee to Europe, study contraception where it was legal, and return with knowledge that could change everything. For a year, Sanger lived as a fugitive in England and France, studying with doctors and researchers who openly discussed family planning. She learned about diaphragms, cervical caps, and safe contraceptive methods that American women were dying without. Every day in exile made her more determined. She wasn't just running from the law anymore, she was preparing for war. A war against ignorance, against Comstock, against a system that treated women's lives as expendable. She would return to America with a plan that would shake the entire country. October 1916. Margaret Sanger returns to New York with contraceptives hidden in her luggage and revolution in her heart. The federal charges are still waiting. Comstock's agents are still hunting her, but she has a new strategy: direct action. If the law won't change, she'll break it so publicly, so dramatically, that the courts will have to act. Her plan: open America's first birth control clinic, right in Brooklyn, right under the government's nose. She rented a storefront on Amboy Street in Brownsville, working-class neighborhood, immigrant families, desperate women. October 16th, 1916, 46 Amboy Street, Brooklyn. A simple storefront with a revolutionary sign: Birth Control Clinic. Margaret Sanger unlocks the door to the first facility in American history where women can legally receive contraceptive information. Well, not legally, but openly. She staffed it with her sister Ethel and a translator for the Yiddish-speaking immigrants. They're selling diaphragms for 10 cents, teaching women how their bodies work, sharing knowledge that's been criminalized for 43 years. Lines form around the block within hours. For 9 miraculous days, the clinic operates in broad daylight. Women arrive before dawn, clutching their life savings. Mothers bring daughters. Wives share whispered conversations about hope for the first time. Margaret sees tears of relief as women finally learn what they've desperately needed to know. But she knows it can't last. Comstock's postal inspectors are watching. Local police are getting pressure. Someone will stop this. The only question is when. Every day feels borrowed. Every woman they help is worth the risk of what's coming. October 26th, 1916. Day 10. Margaret arrives at the clinic to find plainclothes police officers waiting. One poses as a mother, needing help, wearing a wire. Another watches from across the street. The trap is closing. But Margaret doesn't stop. She counsels the undercover officer, just like any other woman, explains how diaphragms work, sells her contraceptives, commits federal crimes while staring directly into the government's eyes. She knows this conversation is ending her freedom, but it might just save the movement. Sometimes revolution requires sacrifice. The arrest happens fast. Police storm through the clinic doors, handcuffs ready. Margaret doesn't resist. She's been preparing for this moment for 2 years. As they lead her away, dozens of women watch from the sidewalk, some crying, some shouting support, all of them understanding that this woman in handcuffs just risked everything for their freedom. Margaret Sanger, enemy of Anthony Comstock, defender of women's rights, is charged with maintaining a public nuisance. The penalty? Prison. But the precedent? That's about to change American history forever. Queens County Penitentiary. Margaret Sanger sits in her cell, sentenced to 30 days for the crime of helping women control their fertility. Outside, protests are growing. Inside, she's planning her next move. The clinic is closed, but the movement has just begun. Her arrest isn't defeat, it's strategy. Every day behind bars proves the law's cruelty. Every newspaper headline spreads her message further. Comstock thinks he's won, but Margaret knows something he doesn't. Sometimes the most dangerous place for a revolutionary is prison. The real fight starts now. Chipping away at the Comstock Act. By 1900, something was shifting in America. The iron grip Anthony Comstock had on women's bodies was starting to loosen. Not quickly, not easily, but real cracks were forming in his fortress of moral law. Brave women were testing the boundaries. Smart lawyers were finding loopholes. Progressive doctors were quietly changing their minds about birth control. This is the story of how 50 years of legal oppression began to crumble, how women stopped asking permission and started demanding justice. The beginning of the end. The first crack came from an unexpected place. The courts themselves. See, the Comstock Act was written so broadly that it criminalized basically anything related to preventing pregnancy. But that vagueness, it would become its weakness. Smart defense attorneys started picking apart the language. What exactly counted as obscene? Who decided? And here's the thing that gets me. Some judges were starting to ask these same questions. They'd look at medical textbooks or educational pamphlets and think, wait, this doesn't seem like pornography. This seems like information. Mary Ware Dennett became the perfect test case. She'd written this pamphlet called The Sex Side of Life back in 1918, basically a straightforward guide to human sexuality for young people. No dirty pictures, no lewd language, just honest medical facts about how bodies work. When postal authorities declared it obscene and prosecuted her in 1929, Dennett fought back. Her lawyer argued something revolutionary, that educational material about sex couldn't be obscene just because it discussed reproduction. The appeals court agreed. First major victory. The Dennett decision in 1930 changed everything. The court ruled that educational materials weren't automatically obscene just because they discussed sex or contraception. They had to be judged by whether they appealed to prurient interest and lacked scientific or educational value. Suddenly, there was breathing room. Publishers could mail medical texts. Doctors could send information to patients. Marriage counselors could distribute guides to family planning. The wall Comstock built wasn't broken yet, but there was definitely a door cracking open. Meanwhile, Margaret Sanger was planning her comeback. Remember, she'd fled to Europe in 1914 to avoid prosecution, then served jail time when she returned. By the 1920s, she was done playing defense. Time to go on the offensive. She founded the American Birth Control League in 1921, started lobbying for what she called the Doctors Only Bill, legislation that would let physicians prescribe contraceptives for medical reasons. She wasn't trying to overturn Comstock completely. She was being strategic. Give doctors an exception first. Here's what's brilliant about Sanger's strategy. She reframed birth control from a women's rights issue to a medical issue. Instead of talking about female autonomy and sexual freedom, which terrified conservative lawmakers, she talked about maternal health and family spacing, doctors preventing dangerous pregnancies, spacing births to protect women's health, preventing hereditary diseases. Same goal, different language. And you know what? It worked. Physicians started coming around. Medical schools began quietly teaching contraceptive methods again. The medical profession's shift was huge. By the 1930s, the American Medical Association was cautiously endorsing physician-prescribed contraception. State medical societies followed suit. Teaching hospitals started including family planning in their curricula. What Comstock had driven underground for 50 years was slowly, carefully, coming back into the light. Not as obscenity, not as immorality, as medicine, as healthcare, as something doctors had a professional duty to provide when medically indicated. The moral crusade was becoming a medical practice. Then came the one package case in 1936. Dr. Hannah Stone ordered a package of contraceptive devices from Japan for medical research. Customs seized it under the Comstock Act. Stone sued. The federal court ruled that the Comstock laws didn't apply to physicians importing contraceptives for legitimate medical purposes. Another crack in the wall, another exception. The law wasn't dead, but it was definitely wounded. Doctors could now legally import, prescribe, and discuss contraceptives, as long as it was for medical reasons. By 1940, the transformation was remarkable. What had been completely illegal in 1900 was now widely accepted medical practice. Sanger's American Birth Control League had evolved into Planned Parenthood. Birth control clinics operated openly in most states. Medical journals published articles on contraceptive techniques. Pharmaceutical companies were developing new methods. The underground network of whispered information and dangerous folk remedies was being replaced by professional medical care. Women could finally get safe, effective birth control from trained physicians. The numbers tell the story. In 1930, there were maybe 50 birth control clinics in America, most operating in legal grey areas. By 1940, over 400 organizations providing family planning services. Medical schools were training doctors in contraceptive methods. Pharmaceutical research was producing better, safer products. Public health departments were offering family planning as part of maternal health programs. What Comstock tried to eliminate had not just survived, it was thriving. The war was almost won. The cultural shift was just as important as the legal one. Birth control was no longer whispered about in back alleys. Women's magazines ran articles on family planning. Churches, some churches anyway, started accepting contraception for married couples. Even conservative politicians stopped calling it obscene. The idea that women should have some control over their fertility had moved from radical fringe idea to mainstream medical practice. Comstock's vision of enforced motherhood was crumbling, replaced by the revolutionary concept of Planned Parenthood. By 1948, 75 years after Comstock's crusade began, the battle was essentially over. Birth control was legal, accessible, and socially acceptable for married couples. Doctors prescribed it routinely, clinics operated openly, research continued freely. The Comstock Act still existed on paper, but it was a dead letter, a relic of Victorian moral panic that had no power over modern American women. The cage had been broken, the doors were open, freedom was here, at least for some women, in some places. Dawn after darkness, the Comstock legacy. By 1936, something was shifting. The stranglehold Anthony Comstock had placed on women's bodies was finally loosening, not because Congress suddenly grew a conscience, but because brave women kept breaking his law. Margaret Sanger's arrest in 1916 had created cracks. Each prosecution revealed how absurd it was to treat birth control as obscenity. Doctors started questioning why they couldn't help patients prevent pregnancy. Even judges began to see the madness in criminalizing medical information about women's own bodies. United States v. 1 package changed everything in 1936. A doctor had imported contraceptive supplies from Japan. The government seized them under Comstock's law, but the court ruled differently this time. Physicians could import contraceptives for legitimate medical purposes. It was a narrow victory, but it was victory. The wall Comstock built was crumbling, brick by brick. Women's healthcare was slowly being redefined as medicine, not crime. The tide was turning, and it felt like waking up from a nightmare that had lasted 60 years. By the 1940s, Comstock's ghost was retreating. Birth control clinics opened across the country. The medical profession embraced family planning. What had been criminal obscenity was becoming accepted healthcare. But the law itself, still on the books, still threatening. Connecticut had made it illegal to even use birth control. Married couples could be arrested for using contraception in their own bedrooms. The Comstock legacy lived on in state laws that treated women's bodies as property of the government. Then came Griswold v. Connecticut in 1965. 92 years after Comstock convinced Congress that birth control was obscenity, the Supreme Court finally said enough. The Constitution protects marital privacy. The government can't police what married couples do in their bedrooms. It was revolutionary, and it was obvious. How had it taken nearly a century to recognize that women deserved autonomy over their own reproduction? The Comstock era was officially ending, but its ghost would keep haunting American women for decades to come. Unmarried women had to wait until 1972. Eisenstadt v. Baird extended contraceptive rights beyond marriage. If the right to privacy means anything, the court wrote, it means the right of the individual to make reproductive decisions. Individual, not just married women, not just women with husbands' permission, individual women making choices about their own bodies. It should have been the end of Comstock's vision. But American politics has a way of resurrecting old battles in new clothes. Here's the unsettling part. The Comstock Act never actually died. It was weakened, bypassed, forgotten. But it's still federal law. Title 18 of the United States Code still contains provisions making it illegal to mail obscene matter or anything designed for preventing conception. Modern politicians have started noticing this zombie law, wondering if it could be used to restrict abortion access even in states where it's legal. The same moral crusade that drove Anthony Comstock is rising again. The pattern repeats itself like a fever dream. Different decade, same arguments. Women's autonomy threatens social order. Birth control encourages promiscuity. The government must protect morality by controlling fertility. Anthony Comstock would recognize every talking point. He'd be proud to see his crusade reborn in modern politics. The cycle comes full circle. Rights won through struggle can be lost through complacency. The women who fought the Comstock laws understood this. They knew freedom requires eternal vigilance. Think about how fragile these victories really are. From 1873 to 1965, American women lived under laws that criminalized knowledge about their own bodies. 92 years of government control over female fertility. The right to contraception has existed for less than 60 years. The right to abortion access, even less. These aren't ancient freedoms rooted in centuries of law. They're recent victories, won by women who risked everything to break unjust laws. And what was won through struggle can be lost the same way. But tonight, let's remember the women who survived. Sarah Chase, sentenced to prison for selling contraceptive sponges. Emma Goldman, repeatedly arrested for lecturing about birth control. Margaret Sanger, jailed for opening America's first birth control clinic. Mary Ware Dennett, prosecuted for writing sex education pamphlets. They lived through the darkness so we could reach this dawn. Their courage broke the chains Comstock forged. Their sacrifices won the freedoms we now take for granted. They deserve to be remembered. Picture them in quieter moments. Margaret Sanger reading bedtime stories to her children, knowing she might be arrested tomorrow. Emma Goldman writing letters by lamplight, planning her next lecture despite the threats. Dr. Sarah Chase examining patients, providing the healthcare that federal law declared obscene. These women carried on with ordinary life while fighting extraordinary battles. They found joy and love and purpose, even while living under laws designed to control their bodies and silence their voices. The dawn after darkness isn't just about legal victories or court cases. It's about the morning a woman could walk into a doctor's office and ask for birth control without fear of prosecution. The day a mother could write her daughter a letter about preventing pregnancy without worrying about postal inspectors. The moment when women's healthcare became medicine instead of crime. These small freedoms, these ordinary rights, were paid for with imprisonment, exile, and sometimes death. As you drift toward sleep, carry their story with you. The women who endured 50 years of the Comstock laws so that information about your body wouldn't be treated as obscenity, so that your choices about pregnancy wouldn't be crimes, so that your autonomy wouldn't be subject to one man's moral crusade. Rest peacefully in the freedoms they won, but remember how recently these rights were granted, and how vigilant we must remain to keep them.